I was standing in my mother's living room, holding a gift bag that weighed almost nothing, when I realized this birthday wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. The room was full. Aunts, cousins, neighbors, even a few of my sister's friends I barely recognized. Phones were already raised, ready to capture the moment my mother had been building up all evening. She stood near the center of the room, smiling too brightly, one hand resting on my sister's shoulder like she was presenting a prize she'd won. "And now," my mother said, drawing out the words, "the real surprise." She handed my sister a folder. Inside were keys, deed papers. Gasps rippled through the room as my mother announced it proudly, almost ceremonially. A brand new apartment. $250,000. Paid in full. Applause broke out. Someone laughed in disbelief. My sister covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes as she hugged our mother, already talking about the neighborhood, the view, the space she'd finally have all to herself. Then my mother turned to me. She pressed a small gift into my hand. Light, cheap, the kind of thing you grab at the checkout counter without thinking. $5, maybe less. I didn't even have to open it to know. When I looked up, she met my eyes and said calmly, as if this explained everything, "Fair is fair." In that moment, I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmed. Like a question I'd been asking my entire life had finally been answered out loud. My name is Sophia Turner. I was 27 years old, and I had come to this house hoping for nothing more than to feel like I belonged. I didn't need an apartment. I didn't need money. I had my own place, my own career, my own life that I'd built piece by piece without anyone handing me the keys. I paid my own bills. I made my own decisions. I had learned how to stand on my own long ago. What I hadn't learned was how to stop hoping that one day that would be enough for my mother. The living room buzzed with excitement around me. People crowded my sister, asking questions, congratulating her, praising my mother for being so generous. Someone joked about how lucky she was. Someone else said this was what good parenting looked like. No one asked me how I felt. I stood there, gift still unopened in my hand, watching the celebration move around me like I was part of the furniture. I smiled when someone looked my way. I nodded when my sister caught my eye, already lost in her moment. It wasn't that anyone was being intentionally cruel. It was worse than that. They simply didn't notice. My mother thrived in moments like this. She loved the admiration, the sense that she was being seen as a devoted parent who gave everything to her children, especially one child. She had always been like this with my sister, protective, attentive, quick to step in whenever life felt even slightly uncomfortable for her. If my sister struggled, my mother called it sensitivity. If I struggled, she called it resilience. And resilience, apparently, didn't need rewards. I moved toward the edge of the room, pretending to examine a photo on the wall while conversations swirled behind me. I could hear my mother explaining how hard this year had been for my sister, how she deserved something stable, something secure, something to show how loved she was. I waited, foolishly, for someone to balance the scale, for my mother to add, and of course, we made sure Sophia felt just as celebrated. For someone to ask what was in my bag. Nothing came. I finally looked down and opened the gift, a small novelty item, the kind of thing you give when you don't know someone very well, or when you don't want to put much thought into it. I felt something settle in my chest, heavy and cold. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about what the gift said out loud. They said my sister needed to be invested in. They said she was worth securing. They said I, on the other hand, would be fine no matter what, that I didn't require care, that my feelings were optional. When I glanced back into the room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My mother was already talking about timing, about paperwork, about how long this apartment deal had taken to finalize. This wasn't a spontaneous act of generosity. It hadn't been decided last week or even last month. This had been planned. Carefully, quietly, long before tonight. The realization landed slowly, but when it did, it changed everything. This birthday wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. It was a declaration. And as I stood there, smiling politely with a $5 gift in my hand while my sister celebrated her new life, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the night my mother embarrassed me. This was the night I finally stopped lying to myself about who I was in this family. I didn't leave the house right away. After the applause faded and people drifted back into their conversations, I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall, watching the evening settle into something familiar. Laughter, compliments, my mother glowing under the attention, my sister being passed from hug to hug like a newly crowned queen, and beneath it all that quiet, unmistakable feeling I'd had so many times before. The sense that I had seen this scene already, not once, not twice, but over and over, just with different decorations. I realized then that my reaction wasn't grief. It was recognition. I wasn't reliving old pain. I was reviewing evidence. My mind went back, not in a rush of emotion, but methodically, like opening a file that had been growing thicker for years. I remembered my childhood birthdays, how my sisters were planned weeks in advance, complete with themes, cakes ordered from her favorite bakery, and photos carefully staged for albums and later social media posts. Mine were often combined with holidays or pushed to a weekend that worked better for everyone else. "You don't mind," my mother would say, and I never did. Or at least I learned not to. When gifts were handed out, there was always an explanation ready. My sister needed encouragement. She needed motivation. She struggled more than I did. I was told this so often that it began to sound like praise. I was strong. I was easy. I didn't need much. Strength became the reason I received less. As we got older, the pattern didn't change. It just became more sophisticated. In middle school, when my sister fell behind in class, my mother hired tutors without hesitation. When I excelled, my achievements were met with a nod and an expectation that I'd keep doing well without help. "You've always been self-driven," she'd say, as if that meant I didn't deserve support. By high school, I had learned the rules well. Don't ask, don't complain, don't make things harder. I was praised for being low maintenance, for not adding stress, for being the daughter who didn't cause problems. Meanwhile, my sister was allowed to unravel. Her emotional outbursts were treated as delicate crises. Plans shifted around her moods. Decisions were delayed if she felt overwhelmed. The family bent toward her without question. And every time I noticed, every time I felt the imbalance, my mother had the same answer. "She needs us more." By the time college came around, the disparity could no longer be explained away as childhood favoritism. I still remember the conversation clearly. I had been accepted into a good program, proud and terrified all at once. I sat at the kitchen table with my mother as she sighed and told me they simply couldn't afford to help me financially. Not right now, not with everything going on. I believed her. I adjusted. I took out loans. I worked late shifts and weekends. I learned how to survive on little sleep and too much responsibility. When my sister went to college 2 years later, everything was suddenly possible. Tuition covered, housing arranged, emergency funds set aside just in case. When I asked about it, carefully, I was met with a familiar explanation. "You'll manage," she wouldn't. That sentence stayed with me longer than any lecture about family or gratitude. Standing in the living room now, watching my sister show off her new keys, I saw how that same logic had followed us into adulthood. My independence had never been a point of pride for my mother. It had been a convenience. I looked around the room again. People admired the apartment gift like it was proof of love, proof of fairness. No one questioned why one daughter needed security while the other apparently needed nothing at all. I caught my mother's eye from across the room. For a moment I wondered if she saw me, really saw me. But her attention drifted back to my sister almost immediately, already discussing timelines and logistics, already deep into plans that didn't include me. I felt something inside me shift then, not anger, not sadness, something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. I wasn't the overlooked child. I was the child who had been assigned a role, the reliable one, the capable one, the one who absorbed pressure so others didn't have to. And the moment I stopped playing that role, the entire structure would wobble. I noticed a detail I might have missed before, my mother mentioning how long it had taken to finalize the apartment paperwork, how complicated the process had been, how many conversations it required. This hadn't been a last-minute decision. It hadn't been a generous impulse. It had been planned carefully, deliberately, long before tonight, which meant my $5 gift hadn't been an afterthought. It had been intentional, too. The realization settled deep. This wasn't about celebrating my sister. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy, about reminding me, publicly and privately, where I stood. I folded the gift bag closed and held it loosely at my side. Around me, the celebration continued, louder now, brighter. But I felt strangely removed from it all, as if I'd stepped just outside the frame of a picture I'd been trapped in my entire life. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix anything. I didn't feel responsible for smoothing the moment or protecting my mother's image or keeping the peace. I simply observed. And as the night wore on and the house slowly emptied, one thought grew clearer with every passing minute. This wasn't the end of a bad evening. It was the beginning of a decision I had been avoiding for years. The house felt different once the last guests left. The laughter thinned out, replaced by the soft clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation drifting from the kitchen. Coats were gathered, doors closed, cars pulled away one by one. The celebration didn't end so much as it retreated inward, condensing around my mother and my sister like it always did. I moved through the living room quietly, collecting empty glasses, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening. Old habits, muscle memory. No one asked me to help, but no one stopped me either. It was easier to stay busy than to stand still and feel everything settling into place. My mother and sister sat at the dining table, heads bent together, talking in excited, overlapping bursts. I caught fragments as I passed by. Square footage, neighborhood names. How quickly everything had come together once the right opportunity appeared. My sister laughed, high and breathless, already imagining her future. Neither of them noticed when I went upstairs. My childhood bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, preserved in a way that felt more like neglect than sentimentality. The same pale walls. The same dresser. A space that no longer belonged to me, but had never truly been let go of either. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house breathe around me. For the first time that night, I let myself think without filtering the thoughts for anyone else's comfort. I had spent my entire life learning how not to be a problem, how to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how to soften disappointment into something manageable, how to make myself smaller so others could feel secure. And for years, I'd mistaken that for maturity. But standing there, alone in a room that hadn't grown with me, I finally understood what it had cost. I hadn't been chosen to be strong, I'd been required to be. There was a difference. I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone. I didn't want explanations or apologies. I knew how those conversations ended. Tears, deflection. The same familiar language about sacrifice and love, and how hard things had been for my sister. Nothing would change because nothing ever had. What I wanted, unexpectedly, was space. I opened my suitcase and began to pack. Not everything, just enough. Clothes I'd brought with me, my laptop, a few personal items I didn't want to leave behind. Each choice felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. I wasn't fleeing, I was deciding. The clock on my phone read 2:14 in the morning when I zipped the suitcase closed. The house was quiet now. I stepped into the hallway and paused, listening. My mother's door was closed. My sister's light was off. The only sound came from the faint buzz of the refrigerator downstairs. I carried my bag down slowly, each step measured. The living room lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. The dining table still held the remnants of celebration, plates stacked carelessly, a half-empty bottle of wine. I stopped near the entryway and reached into my pocket, pulling out the small gift I'd been given earlier that night, I held it for a moment, turning it over in my hands. It felt lighter now than it had before, as if it had already lost whatever meaning it was supposed to carry. I placed it carefully on the console table near the front door, right where it couldn't be missed in the morning. No note, no explanation, just the object itself, returned exactly as it had been given. It wasn't meant to punish anyone. It was meant to mark an ending. I picked up my keys and slipped on my coat. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. It felt like a shock to my system in the best possible way. I stepped outside and closed the door softly behind me. I didn't look back. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of the night. My car sat where I'd parked it earlier, untouched. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I waited for guilt to hit me, for panic, for the familiar surge of anxiety that usually followed any choice that disrupted the family's rhythm. Instead, there was only a strange, steady calm. I realized then how much of my fear had been borrowed. Fear of disappointing my mother, fear of being misunderstood, fear of what might happen if I stopped holding everything together. But as the road stretched out ahead of me, I understood something I'd never allowed myself to before. The consequences I'd been afraid of were no longer worse than the cost of staying. I didn't know exactly what the morning would bring. I could already imagine the confusion, the anger, the accusations. I knew my absence wouldn't be taken quietly. My mother didn't lose control gracefully, and she had lost it the moment I stopped complying. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to manage the fallout before it happened. I was letting it come. As I merged onto the highway, the city lights flickering in the distance, I felt a clarity settle over me that I hadn't known I was missing. This wasn't escape. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't revenge. It was a refusal. And somewhere behind me, in a house that had never quite been home, the silence I left behind was already beginning to speak louder than any argument I could have made. Morning came quietly for me. I woke up to pale light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, the kind of soft, anonymous brightness that belongs to places meant for temporary stays. For a few seconds I didn't remember where I was. Then everything settled back into place, not with panic, but with a strange sense of relief. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it right away. I stretched, listened to the distant hum of traffic, and noticed how calm my body felt. No tight chest, no racing thoughts, just stillness. It was only when I finally picked up my phone that the chaos revealed itself. Missed calls stacked one after another, messages flooding in, some sent minutes apart, others almost on top of each other. I didn't need to open them to know who they were from. Back at my mother's house, the morning had not been quiet. I could picture it clearly without being there. My mother waking up, expecting the afterglow of celebration, expecting coffee, plans, control. She would have walked into the living room and stopped short, her eyes going immediately to the console table by the door. The gift, still there, unopened, unclaimed, returned. That was when confusion would have turned into something sharper. She would have gone upstairs, knocked once on my bedroom door, then opened it without waiting for an answer. The untouched bed, the empty closet, the absence that couldn't be explained away. By the time she reached for her phone, the story in her head would already be forming. The first message I opened was exactly what I expected. "Where are you?" The next came barely a minute later. "Why did you leave that gift there?" Then the tone shifted. "You embarrassed me. Do you have any idea how this looks?" I scrolled slowly, not responding. Concern morphed into accusation with remarkable speed. My sister's name appeared in the thread soon after, her messages confused and defensive, asking if I was being dramatic, if I couldn't just come back and talk like an adult. My father's messages were quieter, short, cautious, asking me to call when I could. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I set my phone down and let the silence stretch. It was strange how familiar the pattern felt, even from a distance. My mother's panic wasn't about my safety. It was about control, about the narrative slipping out of her hands, about the questions she wouldn't be able to deflect if I wasn't there to smooth things over. Back in that house, the dynamic was already shifting. Without me there to absorb tension, it had nowhere to go but inward. My sister, used to being protected from discomfort, would be overwhelmed by the sudden pressure. My mother, used to directing energy outward, would have to confront the chaos she'd always managed through me. I could almost hear it: raised voices, sharp words, blame-changing targets. The realization didn't bring me satisfaction, it brought confirmation. I finally typed a response, keeping it brief and precise. I left because I needed space. I'm safe. I won't be coming back today. I sent it and put the phone on silent. The messages kept coming anyway. By mid-morning, the tone had shifted again. Accusations softened into appeals. My mother wrote about how worried she was, how unfair it was to disappear like that, how families didn't treat each other this way. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, as if a ledger could erase imbalance. What struck me most was what she didn't say. She didn't ask why I'd been hurt. She didn't mention the gift. She didn't acknowledge the difference between an apartment and a $5 trinket. Instead, she framed the entire situation as my failure to be reasonable, to be grateful, to fall back into line. From where I sat, sipping coffee in a quiet room that belonged to no one I owed anything to, it all felt strangely distant. The urgency that usually hooked into my chest simply wasn't there. I saw the messages for what they were: proof that nothing had changed, proof that leaving had been necessary. As the hours passed, the ripple effects widened. I started receiving messages from extended family members, a cousin asking if everything was okay, an aunt gently suggesting I talk to my mother before things got out of hand. The story was already being shaped without me. That afternoon, my phone rang again. My mother's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. A moment later, a new message came through. "I'm coming to see you. We need to talk face to face." I stared at the screen, feeling neither fear nor surprise. Of course she was. Silence had never been something my mother tolerated. It threatened her authority. It removed her ability to steer the outcome. If I wouldn't return to the house, she would bring the confrontation to me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The decision had already been made the moment I walked out the door in the middle of the night. Everything that followed was just consequence. As the afternoon light shifted, and the city outside continued on like nothing had happened, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was no longer about a birthday. It was about what happens when the person holding everything together finally lets go. She found me 2 days later. I was walking out of a small cafe near my apartment, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, when I saw her standing on the sidewalk like she'd been planted there. Perfect coat, composed posture. That familiar expression she wore when she was already rehearsing how the conversation was supposed to end. "Sophia," she said, sharp and controlled, "we need to talk." Not hello, not are you okay, just business. I didn't pretend to be surprised. I nodded once and gestured toward the empty bench near the window. "You can sit if you want." She sat, smoothing her coat like this was a meeting she had scheduled, not a confrontation she'd forced. Her eyes scanned my face, looking for cracks. I gave her none. "You can't just disappear like that," she began. "People are asking questions." There it was. Not concern. Damage control. "I didn't disappear," I said evenly. "I left." She exhaled sharply, already irritated by my tone. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed your sister. Do you have any idea how that looked?" I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. I wasn't aware my role was to manage appearances. Her jaw tightened. "That's not what I mean, and you know it. Families don't behave this way. You don't walk out in the middle of the night like a child having a tantrum." I met her eyes. "I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't ruin anything. I removed myself." "That's the same thing," she snapped. "You're being dramatic." I almost smiled. Almost. "I'm being consistent," I said. "I finally acted the way you've always treated me, quietly, without making a scene. Her face flushed. This has nothing to do with gifts. You've always twisted things like this. I shook my head slowly. It has everything to do with what the gifts represent. And you know that. She waved her hand dismissively. Your sister needed stability. She's had a difficult year. So have I said. I just don't advertise it. That landed harder than I expected. She shifted in her seat, recalibrating. You've always been strong, she said, lowering her voice as if that made it kinder. You don't need the same things she does. I needed fairness, I replied. I needed acknowledgement. I needed not to be treated like I was invisible unless something went wrong. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment I saw the familiar tactic forming. Tears, emotion, redirection. I've done everything for this family, she said, and this is how you repay me? I didn't rise to it. This isn't about repayment, it's about boundaries. That word set her off. Boundaries? She scoffed. Since when do you talk like that? Who's putting these ideas in your head? No one, I said. That's the point. She leaned forward then, voice dropping. You need to come home. We have things to sort out. What things? I asked. She hesitated, just long enough. The apartment paperwork, she said finally. There are issues, timelines. Your sister is overwhelmed. There it was, the real reason. You want me to fix it, I said. I want you to help, she corrected quickly. You're good at these things. I'm good at carrying what no one else wants to, I said. I'm done with that. Her expression hardened. If you don't step in, this is going to get complicated. That's not my problem, I said quietly. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. Do you hear yourself? After everything we've done for you? I leaned back against the bench. You didn't do this for me. You did it because I made things easier for you. That's unfair, she snapped. No, I said. What's unfair is asking me to clean up a mess you created after telling me I should be grateful for $5. Her mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't expected that. You're being selfish, she said finally. If you walk away from this family, don't expect things to be the same. I nodded. I don't. She stood abruptly, anger radiating off her. You'll regret this. I stood too, meeting her gaze. I regret staying silent for so long. She searched my face one last time, looking for the daughter who would back down, who would apologize, who would take responsibility. She didn't find her. Without another word, she turned and walked away, heels striking the pavement with sharp, decisive steps. I watched her go, feeling my pulse slow instead of spike. For the first time in my life, I hadn't fixed anything. I hadn't soothed, explained, or surrendered. And as I unlocked my car and got in, I understood something she didn't yet. By refusing to step back into my role, I hadn't caused the collapse. I'd simply stopped holding it together. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, through half-finished sentences, missed calls I didn't answer, and messages that were clearly meant to sound casual but carried an edge of urgency beneath them. I didn't hear everything directly. I didn't need to. The shape of it was familiar enough. A few days after my mother confronted me, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. Your sister is having a hard time. We didn't realize how much you handled. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a statement of fact, finally spoken out loud. From what I gathered later, the apartment that had looked so perfect under birthday lights quickly became something else entirely. Deadlines, documents, decisions that couldn't be postponed or smoothed over with reassurance. My sister, who had always been shielded from the uncomfortable parts of adulthood, was suddenly expected to navigate them on her own. She didn't take it well. She called our mother constantly, asked the same questions over and over, panicked when answers weren't immediate. Every small obstacle felt like a personal crisis. And for the first time, there was no one stepping in quietly behind the scenes to translate, organize, and calm things down. Because I wasn't there, my mother tried to compensate at first. She hovered, she reassured, she snapped at customer service representatives, and blamed outside forces when things didn't move fast enough. But frustration began to seep in, sharp and unfiltered. I could imagine it easily. My mother losing patience with the very daughter she had spent years protecting from discomfort. My sister shrinking under criticism she'd never been taught to handle. The dynamic turning inward, feeding on itself. The absence of my role became impossible to ignore. I had been the one who read contracts carefully, the one who remembered deadlines, the one who explained things twice without sounding condescending, the one who absorbed emotional fallout so it didn't explode elsewhere. Without that buffer, everything felt louder. Messages started coming to me indirectly. A text from an aunt asking if I'd be willing to just take a look at something. A voicemail from a family friend hinting that things would go more smoothly if I stepped in, just this once. I recognized the trap immediately. Just this once had been the phrase that kept me tethered for years. I didn't respond. The silence was its own kind of statement, and it seemed to rattle people more than anger ever had. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't explaining. I was simply unavailable. That was when the narrative began to wobble. My mother had always controlled the story. She framed situations carefully, presenting herself as generous, patient, endlessly self-sacrificing. I had unknowingly supported that image by being the reliable one, the calm one, the daughter who never made waves. Now, without me there to reinforce it, cracks started to show. Extended family members noticed inconsistencies. Questions arose about why my sister needed so much help if she was being given so much, why everything seemed to be falling apart over a gift that was supposed to solve problems, not create them. I heard through a cousin that my mother was growing increasingly defensive, that she complained about being unappreciated, that she said I'd changed, become cold, ungrateful. The irony didn't escape me. Meanwhile, my own life felt strangely steady. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I slept through the night without replaying conversations in my head. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis to manage. I did think about my sister. More than I expected to. I saw her now with a clarity that had been impossible before. She wasn't malicious. She was unprepared. Raised to believe that support would always arrive before discomfort, she had never learned how to tolerate uncertainty. That wasn't her fault, but fixing it wasn't my responsibility either. One evening, I received a long message from her. It was disjointed, emotional, full of frustration. She didn't accuse me directly, but the implication was clear. Things were harder without me. She didn't understand why I'd left. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, I said nothing. I wasn't punishing her. I was protecting myself. The real shift came when my father called again a week later. His voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under," he said quietly. "I should have paid attention." It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer than anything I'd received in years. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long moment, letting the weight of that acknowledgement settle. It didn't erase the past. It didn't fix everything. But it confirmed what I'd already learned. The system hadn't collapsed because I left. It collapsed because it had been built on imbalance, and imbalance can only hold as long as someone agrees to carry the extra weight. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't demanded justice. I had simply stepped out of the role that made everything seem functional. And in doing so, I let the truth surface on its own. Whatever happened next would happen without me propping it up. For the first time, that knowledge didn't feel cruel. It felt fair. The weeks that followed felt quieter than I expected. Not empty, not lonely, just unburdened. Without the constant hum of family tension in the background, my days settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign at first. I woke up without bracing myself for messages. I went to work focused, no longer distracted by the low-level anxiety I'd learned to treat as normal. Evenings belonged to me in a way they never had before. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be needed. I hadn't announced any of this to my family. I hadn't made declarations or set ultimatums. I simply redirected my energy toward my career, toward friendships that didn't come with conditions, toward rest. The difference was immediate. At work, I found myself volunteering for projects I would have previously avoided, not because I lacked confidence, but because I lacked bandwidth. I'd been exhausted from carrying emotional weight that had nothing to do with my own life. Without it, my focus sharpened, my ideas landed, my efforts were noticed. It was a strange thing, realizing how much I'd been holding myself back to keep others comfortable. I also started therapy, something I'd postponed for years because there was always a family issue that seemed more urgent. In that quiet room, with someone who had no stake in my obedience or silence, patterns became visible in ways they never had before. I wasn't broken. I hadn't failed to earn love. I had simply adapted to an environment where love came with terms and conditions. Naming that truth was both painful and freeing. My phone still buzzed occasionally with messages from home, but they came less frequently now and with less force. My mother's words no longer carried the same authority. She tried once or twice to frame my distance as confusion, as a phase, as something that would pass once I calmed down. I didn't correct her. I didn't need her to understand. My father reached out again, more carefully this time. Short messages. Neutral updates. No pressure. We met for coffee once, in a public place where the conversation couldn't slip into old patterns. He listened more than he spoke. When he admitted that staying silent for years had been easier than intervening, I believed him. That didn't mean I forgave him completely. It meant I saw him clearly. My sister stayed mostly quiet. I heard about her struggles indirectly, missed deadlines, financial stress, friction with our mother that no one knew how to diffuse anymore. The golden child, without the system built to protect her, was learning how exposed she really was. I didn't take satisfaction in that. What I felt instead was a cautious compassion, paired with firm boundaries. I could understand her without rescuing her. I could care without sacrificing myself. That distinction had taken me nearly 3 decades to learn. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, the windows open to let in the early summer air, I realized something else had shifted. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head. I no longer imagined confrontations that might never come. I no longer measured my worth by whether my family approved of my choices. Their silence, once terrifying, had become neutral, and neutrality felt like freedom. There were moments of grief, too. Quiet ones, unexpected ones. When I passed families laughing together in restaurants, when I saw old photos surface online. I mourned the version of family I'd wanted, not the one I had. I allowed myself that grief without trying to resolve it. Healing, I learned, didn't require closure from the people who hurt you. It required honesty with yourself. The biggest change, though, was internal. I stopped performing strength for others. I stopped offering competence as proof that I deserved care. I stopped shrinking my needs to make them more palatable. I wasn't louder. I was truer. As the summer moved forward, I became aware of one final shift back home. Not a crisis, not an emergency. Something quieter. My mother was struggling. Without me there to organize, to anticipate, to absorb, her world felt unstable. The control she'd relied on had slipped through her fingers, and she didn't know how to reclaim it. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing that. I felt resolved. Whatever came next wouldn't be about escape or defiance. It would be about closing a chapter on my terms, not hers. And for the first time, that felt not just possible, but inevitable. Time had a way of softening the noise without erasing the truth. By the time several months had passed, the birthday that changed everything felt distant, like a line drawn clearly behind me. Life had moved forward, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. The kind of progress that doesn't announce itself, but shows up in how easily you breathe when you wake up in the morning. I heard updates about my family the way you hear weather reports from a city you no longer live in. With interest, maybe. With concern sometimes, but without the instinct to rush in and manage the outcome. The apartment that had once been the centerpiece of celebration became a source of quiet tension. Expenses piled up. Decisions stalled. My sister struggled more than anyone expected. Without a buffer between her and reality, everything felt heavier to her than it ever had before. My mother, stripped of the illusion that generosity could replace balance, grew more withdrawn. Friends stopped indulging her complaints. Relatives grew tired of being pulled into explanations that no longer made sense. Control, once effortless, now required energy she didn't know how to summon. There was no dramatic collapse, no apology scene, just a slow reckoning. And strangely, that felt right. I hadn't gone back to the way things were. I hadn't cut everyone off entirely either. Contact existed, but on terms I chose. Short conversations, neutral updates, no emotional negotiations, no guilt-laced obligations. Peace came from consistency, not reconciliation. When my own birthday arrived, I marked it quietly. Dinner with people who knew me for who I was, not what I provided. No spectacle, no comparisons, no explanations. I bought myself a small piece of jewelry I'd admired for months and wore it without feeling the need to justify the expense to anyone. It wasn't expensive, but it was chosen. That difference mattered more than I ever expected. I thought often about the phrase my mother had used so casually, "Fair is fair." For years I'd accepted her definition of fairness without questioning who it served. I'd confused endurance with virtue, silence with maturity. Now I understood something she never had. Fairness isn't handed down by people who benefit from imbalance. It's claimed by those willing to step away from it. Leaving wasn't selfish. Staying had been. Walking away didn't mean I didn't love my family. It meant I finally loved myself enough to stop accepting a version of love that required me to disappear. There were losses, of course, relationships that would never look the same. Moments I'd grieved in private, but there was also something I hadn't anticipated. Relief. Relief from pretending. Relief from fixing. Relief from carrying a weight that was never meant to be mine alone. I didn't win anything tangible by leaving. No inheritance, no apology, no public validation. What I gained was quieter and far more powerful. I gained my life back. If you're listening to this and you've always been the strong one, the capable one, the person told you don't need as much because you handle things so well, I want you to hear this clearly. Being resilient doesn't mean you deserve less care. Being independent doesn't mean you should accept neglect. And walking away from what hurts you isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's survival. If any part of Sophia's story felt familiar to you, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for wanting more than scraps labeled as fairness. If you've lived something like this, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters, even if you were taught to believe it didn't. And if you want to keep hearing real stories about family, boundaries, justice, and quiet strength, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting back, it's choosing yourself, and finally living well. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.